Welcome to the 1600 Sessions, a podcast presented by the White House Historical Association. In each episode, White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews luminaries, historians, and eyewitnesses to history about America's most famous residence and office, the White House. We open the doors to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue because it's not only the president's house, it's the people's house. 56 years ago this month, the White House Historical Association was founded by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy as a nonprofit organization dedicated to the history and future of the White House. In honor of this anniversary, Stuart McLaurin sat down for conversations with two people who were there during the Kennedy administration, Leonard Silverstein and Nash Castro.
On a Friday night, I had a call from the chief usher, and he said, "The president would like to see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. So I drove to town, and I waited at the elevator for him, and we shook hands and talked and walked down the corridor and stood over steps overlooking the garden. He said, "Mr. Castro, what's wrong with my grass?" I said, "Well, Mr. President, it's the wrong grass for Washington." I said, "It's Marion bluegrass. It's fine for where you live in Massachusetts. But the humidity here simply doesn't allow it to thrive." So he said, "Well, what can you do about it?" I said, "The only thing to do is to replace it." Well, he said, "Go to it."
Stuart also talked with former Chief Usher Gary Walters about how the association continues to play an important role today, preserving the White House for generations to come.
Today, we're at the White House Historical Association's offices on historic Lafayette Square overlooking the White House. And we're honored to have as our very special guest a man who has been with the White House Historical Association since its very beginning. We're talking today with Nash Castro. Nash and his wife first moved to Washington in 1961 as Assistant Superintendent of Administration of National Capital Parks. He was designated as the Park Service's liaison to the White House, and he played a pivotal role in the founding of the White House Historical Association, working closely with First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, and Nash, we're honored to say, still serves on the board of the association today. Thank you for joining us, Nash.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it was 56 years ago that you were present for the founding of the association. Tell us how we came to be.
Well, we came to be because of Mrs. Kennedy. She asked J.B. West and me to go to Philadelphia and meet with the publisher of the Saturday Evening Post. What she had in mind in doing that was printing postcards of the staterooms of the White House and selling them to visitors. Well, the president of the printing company assured us he could produce the very best. But on the way back, I said to J.B. West, it would not be dignified to sell postcards at the White House. And I asked him to give my opinion to Mrs. Kennedy, and she honored it. She decided that it wouldn't do. So the idea of the guidebook, we had in the National Park Service the director called Connie Worth, and he happened to be on the board of the National Geographic. So I asked Connie one day if the Geographic might help us with our venture, and at that point, Lorraine Pierce had written the text for the first guidebook.
And Lorraine was the curator at the White House at that time.
That's right. She was the first curator. So Connie talked with Mel Grosvenor, the chairman of the National Geographic. He decided that they would like to work with us. And it turned out that that venture was absolutely what saved us. As a result, we're here today. In short order, they produced the first guidebook. And remembering that the text had already been written, but they sent their photographers to all over the White House taking pictures of all the rooms. And in fact, the first picture on our first guidebook was taken by a National Geographic photographer from the top of a fire ladder.
Oh, and that's the photograph that's looking down on the north portico of the White House.
Exactly.
And we still use a similar image today. Just this month, we released the 24th edition of this guidebook, and We were talking earlier about how many we've sold, and they've been millions over the years.
Oh, yes, of course.
And it's been the proceeds from those books that has in large measure supported the work of the association, probably gone a lot farther than selling postcards would have done. So tell us about what it was like working with Mrs. Kennedy and framing the work of the association back in those early days.
Well, she was very committed to the association. I remember meeting with her along with the publisher, the chairman of the Geographic, the president of the Geographic, the editor-in-chief, Breeden, who had been assigned to work closely with us. And we sat in the Yellow Oval Room on a big divan. She sat on a chair across from us. And she put the dummy in her lap of the first guidebook. And she turned page after page after page. We were there for 2 hours with her.
So she was truly involved in the details
Oh, yes.
of the association, and we all remember that wonderful CBS special
Oh, yeah.
where she toured the White House. Do you have
Oh,
any
yes.
memories of that
I was
occasion?
there.
And so tell us about that day.
Well, Collingwood was the name of the fellow who made the report. We were waiting for in the movie room, and Shea came in with her mother. They'd been out to lunch somewhere. She was beautifully dressed with one of those funny hats, you know. She spent a good bit of time with Collingwood. Edward R. Murrow was also there, and he waited for us in the map room. Eventually, the tour was finished. Well, you know the rest of it.
Right. It's
it turned out to be
iconic.
a
You can still
huge-
see it on YouTube today. It's a wonderful thing to
Yeah.
view. President Kennedy, did he have an opinion on what Mrs. Kennedy was doing in the White House?
Well, he approved of it, of course. And in fact, I think was very proud of her. He and I never talked about her work. He and I talked about the Rose Garden.
Oh, yes. Tell us the story about that. That's a wonderful
Well,
happening.
on a Friday night, I had a call from the chief usher, and he said, "The president would like to see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock." So I drove to town, and I waited at the elevator for him, and we shook hands and talked and walked down the corridor and stood over steps overlooking the garden. He said, "Mr. Castro, what's wrong with my gross?" And I said, "Well, Mr. President, it's the wrong grass for Washington." I said, "It's Marion bluegrass. It's fine for where you live in Massachusetts, but the humidity here simply doesn't allow it to thrive." So he said, "Well, what can you do about it?" I said, "The only thing to do is to replace it." Well, he said, "Go to it." So that's exactly what we did. And then Mrs. Mellon came into the picture,
Yes.
as you know, and that was quite another story.
So he deputized Bunny Mellon to help restore that rose garden. Is that true?
Yeah. He brought her in, and she had a landscape architect named Perry Wheeler who worked with her. And I remember being invited to Mrs. Mellon's house in Georgetown. We sat in the living room, and here I looked at all these French Impressionists on the walls, art that I'd never seen anywhere except in the National Gallery. So she told me what she had in mind. And as a matter of fact, she drew on a 5x7 pad what her concept of the garden was. And that drawing is now at the Kennedy Library somewhere.
Well, that redesign of the rose garden made the rose garden an extra room of the White House, and the president began having ceremonies out there and gatherings out there. It was
Oh,
a
yeah.
very important addition to the White House, wasn't it?
I remember that Mrs. Mellon decided that magnolia trees would be the proper trees, 4 of them, and in the rose garden. So we had our crews go out there and dig up 4 magnolias from West Potomac Park, and the root package was huge, and 4 of them were planted, as you know, 1 at each corner. They're still there.
Still there today, anchoring the 4 corners of the rose garden. So you worked very closely with Mrs. Kennedy, as we've talked about, but we also know you worked very closely with Mrs. Johnson. And she had her own legacy with the White House, didn't
Well,
she?
I met Lady Bird when she launched her beautification program. And I have in my mind a picture taken in front of the Natural History Building on the mall, where she got on her hands and knees and she planted pansies. As a liaison to the White House, I became very involved with her work and traveled with her all over the country. My gosh, we literally traveled all over the country promoting the beautification program. And when that was all said and done, she wanted to continue working with flowers. So I gave her the idea for the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, Texas. And that's a going concern today, after all these years.
Wow. Well, you have quite a legacy, Nash, in your work at the White House and even down in Texas. And as we've talked about, you've been part of our association's work for these 56 years that we're commemorating on our anniversary. And you, better than anyone, can reflect on what we've contributed and the legacy of the association. And tell us, do you think our work is still important, and what impact do you think it's had over the years?
Well, let me say this. I applaud the work of the White House Historical Association. I think what we have achieved and done surpasses anything I visualize, believe me. And I'm so proud of you and your colleagues on the staff who do such a superb job of looking after our interests, and for that I'm so grateful.
Well, thank you, Nash. We have a wonderful board of directors, which you've served for many years, and a terrific staff team here, and we're continuing to grow and evolve the work of the association every day. So what do you think Mrs. Kennedy would think of our work today?
Oh, she would applaud it. I'm sure of that. I'm also sure they should be surprised that we come as far as we have.
And what do you think Mrs. Kennedy would think about the White House today and how it is now the museum standard that she really envisioned for the White House?
I think she would highly approve of it. I think she would express it in her heart more than any other way. Yeah, she'd be very proud of us.
Tell us something that we may not know about your years at the White House or Mrs. Kennedy in the White House. Give us an insider's perspective on something about Mrs. Kennedy and her leadership there that we may not know.
Oh, gosh, that's a hard question. Well, she, remember, she inherited a pretty shabby White House. I guess you know that.
Yes.
Yeah. And she undertook a restoration program. She put together a committee of very well-known Americans, for example, DuPont.
Yes.
Oh gosh, very well-known names for the time. And that's what enabled her to bring the White House back. Yeah.
What's your favorite memory of working in the White House?
Oh, I have so many of them.
Well, you're a favorite memory of ours, in living legacy of Mrs. Kennedy's that's still with us today. And I want to thank you for your leadership and your service and your contributions. And it's an honor for me to work today with someone who worked with Mrs. Kennedy in 1961. And thank you for spending time with us today on this podcast.
Not at all. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. We have the privilege of talking with a great hero of mine, a friend of the White House Historical Association, and a leader and inspiration to our work for a long, long time, Mr. Leonard Silverstein. Mr. Silverstein, you've had such an impressive career serving as an officer in the United States Navy in World War II, and also as an attorney in the Office of the Chief Counsel for the Internal Revenue Service. You've also had a distinguished legal career at your firms, and of course, most important to us, a board member of the White House Historical Association.
Thank you.
Tell us how you first came involved with the White House Historical Association.
Jackie Kennedy went to the National Geographic, Mr. Grosvenor, and she said, would you mind having this booklet, because I've had great interest from the people who saw my television show. And as an aside, prior to the inspiration of the booklet, or simultaneously, Jackie did a walkthrough of the White House at that time. It became very popular, and it still is. But at any rate, with that obligation, the National Geographic agreed to print the White House tour in the booklet. The price was $1. Then came the question what to do with the booklet. And whether it was Jackie or she was very persuasive, as you could imagine, they set up the Park Service, including the Park Service representative to the White House, to arrange with the Geographic to have meetings. And I, for some reason, ended up as part of the group at the Geographic. The meetings were held on the first floor, and the Geographic was the chairman of the meeting. It was an honor to be part of this, and a lot of fun.
Well, Leonard, you've had a front row seat with the work of the association for a long time. And tell us, in your view, what are some of the important elements of our mission? What do we do that's important?
Well, that would stem from the Jackie Kennedy booklet. But the mission more broadly, as I understood it at the time, was to magnify the importance of the White House as a physical standing symbol of what's great about America, because it was made and was used for the common man. And that goes back to Jackson and others. But the conception was, here is a physical entity that portrays what's so great about the United States. Not only great, but unique. And that was the thing that propelled everybody, and they're still doing that.
Do you think our mission is as important today as it was with Mrs. Kennedy?
I think it's more important.
Why is
because thanks in part for your predecessors and your successors, this symbolic exhibition of what's unique about this country has now been realized physically with the White House as a symbol.
Well, this month we're celebrating the 56th anniversary of the association from when Mrs. Kennedy founded us in November of 1961. What do you think she would think of the association today?
I think she would be thrilled. The only time I spoke with her since she was living in New York, and there was a concert followed by a reception, so I had a chance to talk with her a few minutes. She waxed very eloquently about the White House Historical Association. You know, she did.
Well, it's interesting you talked about the White House Visitor Guide, which she insisted that the association do as its first order of business in 1961. And we just released the 24th edition of that book. So it has continued. It's a living legacy of Mrs. Kennedy. We have a team of authors. Our historians work on the guidebook, and we have research assistants that work on the guidebook. But we also work very closely with the curators in the White House. The White House is very generous to allow our photographer to go in, so we get updated photos of the rooms in the White House. And this 24th edition is right up to date, and it's available now. It just came out. In fact, I'll give you one today before you leave.
I was going to say, put me in for an order. That's another $1.
Well, speaking of ways that the association supports itself, 37 years ago, we started making an annual White House Christmas ornament, and that's been very successful. So those who might be listening today, share with them why you think investing in our work and supporting our work is important.
This is the greatest symbol of the United States. And while you can't take the White House to your home, it's easy to buy a Christmas tree ornament at a fraction of the cost. That, to me, is a thrill.
To close our conversation today, tell me about a very special memory or two that you have about working with the association over the years. You've mentioned some of the special people you've worked with, and we've talked about the ornament and Mrs. Kennedy. But tell us about some of the projects that the association has done or something that was meaningful to you.
Well, somewhere along the line, an interest from the White House filtered to the association about china, porcelain, on which you could have dinner. It was brought up on the board, great enthusiastic, that for the first time when I was serving, we provided a series of plates. And I should say, to satisfy the needs of the usher of the White House, you just can't gin up 25 plates. You're talking 200 at least. We ultimately became the supplier. And to this day, when you go there, you'll see the White House service plate, maroon, shines.
The art or the furniture or the portraits?
I guess the portrait of the president or the first lady. This was presented, somebody has to pay for it, and we volunteered. And if you go to the White House today, you'll see the pictures right on the wall, starting with Jackie Kennedy, which is an unusual picture because it's very pensive, I thought. But all of it comes back to the physical symbol of what this wonderful building means. Each and every one of us, impossible to get it off your mind. And we're just so lucky to be part of a process which will survive. It will always be there. That's my pleasure to be part of it.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to have you on our board and to visit with you today about your special memories, and we're grateful for your leadership and your legacy, and you yourself are a key part of White House history. So thank you very much. We're talking to former Chief Usher of the White House, Gary Walters. He served at the White House for 7 first families and was Chief Usher for 4, from Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush. This year, the White House Historical Association recognizes our 56th anniversary since our founding by Mrs. Kennedy in 1961, and you served as Chief Usher more than half of the time the association has been in existence. Tell us about the role of the association and its work in support of the White House from the perspective of the Chief Usher, and of course you served on our board of directors as well. It's a unique dynamic and a special dynamic, and give us your vantage point on the association's work.
Well, back when Mrs. Kennedy worked with the original founders of the White House Historical Association, it was a small enterprise trying to publish a book about the history of the White House and the people who lived there. It has grown today to be just a magnificent repository of information and the ability to pass out more information than was ever available. The electronic media that's available to people to get information from the White House, the school programs, education programs across the country. I don't think anybody ever envisioned the initial books. I think there was 150,000 of the original books that were published and were sold out very quickly, would go to where it is today. As far as the direct impact on the executive residence, the President's house, the White House, the Historical Association has been magnificent in providing funds for the upkeep of some of the public rooms at the White House. And it has been instrumental in allowing the First Ladies to pretty much renew the White House on a regular basis, which ends up being about every 10 years. The various rooms need to be redone about every 10 years. After all, there's usually over 1 million people that come through, and that has its wear and tear on everything from the floors to the furnishings, as well as the sun beating in on the drapes from the south side of the house. So the Historical Association has been marvelous in providing funding for those principal public rooms. Also started, as you well know, the Preservation Fund for a donation of various items that have been purchased for the White House. So I don't think that Mrs. Kennedy ever envisioned it to that extent, nor did the founders. But certainly what has evolved today is something that makes the White House a much more rich environment for people that come through, and the history has become the repository of is just as helpful to education as anything it could be.
Thank you, Gary, for joining us today, and your legacy is living and will extend for generations to come in the White House, which is the great treasure of the American people.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the 1600 Sessions. This podcast is presented by the White House Historical Association and produced by Long Story Short Media. You can subscribe or download new episodes at the1600sessions.org. And you can help others find this podcast by rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thanks again to our very special guests, Nash Castro, Leonard Silverstein, and Gary Walters. And thank you to the U.S. Marine Band Library, which provided the music for this podcast.